JavaScript or TypeScript, what we are using here is object-oriented. And if I want to manage, for example, here some data, I will typically organize this data in objects. For our specific scenario, we will generate some mock data. We will do that, of course, in the app components TS later on, because the app components TS holds our data right now and in this example, of course. But before we can do that, one thing is important, and that is I need to define a type of object, that means an object class, to be able to manage such data later on. Therefore, I create in the app folder just a new file, and I call that file, for example, identities.typescript. Because identities is exactly what I like to manage. And to just manage these identities, I need to create something that is called an interface. I need to add an export in front of the interface. And the next step is, of course, to name that interface. And I want to name that type of data object identity. Let's jump into here a little bit and talk about interfaces and classes. As you know, we are using TypeScript. TypeScript is JavaScript plus some nice add-ons. And one of these add-ons is the interface. The difference between an interface and a class is that if you want to work type secure, if you want to work with constructors or type safe properties, then a class is exactly what you need. But in cases where you try to work with something that is based on something like a type definition, which can be extended later and used in many different modules and cross files, then interfaces are much more flexible. Additionally to that, interfaces in Angular does have two more capabilities might be of interest. One of them is that they are easier to use together with REST services later on. REST services, as you know, just deliver the data as plain text files like JSON files are, and you have to recreate objects if you want to handle them. Here, interfaces are much easier to handle than the more static classes. Secondly, it is easy to use the interface just in data validations. You know, in Angular, there are two types of validation. You can do a simple data validation directly in the HTML, but you can as well, and that is the main course, just to do data validation in our component files. And here, interfaces are more flexible and easier to handle as, for example, classes. Because of that, in our small web project, we decide to use the interface. First, because we want to use that interface in many different components, and that means as well in many different files. And later on, because it will ease us the life just to connect a REST service and get an object out of these plain text JSON files. And now let's just move back to the screen and implement the rest. However, and now I have to define properties. For example, I can define a first name, which is always something important for an identity. I need, of course, to add now as well a data type to my variable, which is string. And then I can directly start with the next property, which is my last name will be a string as well. And then I need an account name, should be a string, and I need a personal number. This time that should be a number. That means it is not text, it is just a number. And I need maybe a cost center and a department. Both are strings again. And last but not least, I need two more properties. One should be a start date. This is of type date. And the other one is an end date. And of course, as well, of date. And with that, I have my complete interface just defined. As you can easily see, my identity objects I want to manage does have some properties. Some of them are text properties. One is a number property, and two of them does have date properties, which is quite good because I can then show you the more complex date time handling as well. Having that created, I can now first save the file, and secondly, just step back to my components. And to be able to work with that specific interface I have created before, I have to import that interface here in the app components first. And what you can see there is I import that interface called identity, and Angular automatically knows it is from the identities.typescript, which is part of the same folder. And with that, I have this component now available. And so I can just start creating my first object, which should be an identity. And that identity is of type identity, of course. And this is then just one single object starting with the first name, Herwig, for example. And then there is a last name, and that is Abele. And we need a personal number. We know that is a number, so I just add 1 as a number. Then we do have a department. This is, for example, training. So, and as we can see, there's one red line more, and that's because of let's create these missing commas. Here they are. And the next thing what's to add here is, of course, my cost center. This is, of course, a string again, and cost center will be 10, for example, 10, 12. And after the comma, we need now to define a date time value or a date value. And this is my start date. Here we are. And the start date, this is a little bit more tricky. This is now a new date value because it needs to be a date value. And to enter a specific date value, I'm using something which is called ISO date. That means the ISO date notation says years at the beginning, and then there is, of course, the month, and then there is the day. And so the 1st January of 1989, this is the start date for that specific employee I already created. And with having my data record created, I can display the data record. Therefore, I step to my app component HTML. And in the app component HTML, I just insert with that specific wrapper, of course, my identity. And with saving that, you can easily see there is now on the right-hand side an object message. This is a typical message in Angular which says the object I try to display and which is written here in the HTML, this object is too complex to show it at the end. And just to get something displayed that makes sense, I can just simplify the object a little bit by just, for example, adding the first name, and then I can directly do the same with the last name. You see, of course, space separated. I put the identity in there and say last name. And if I save the whole thing, then you see there is now my name, which is part of my object, how it was defined. So the whole thing is quite cool, but what is necessary right now, of course, is that we ensure that we get a little bit more than just one object, because one object is a bit less if I want to implement functionality. And to do that, I will now take the object I created and create a new one here in the app component, which is an array of objects. So I take that as a first object and modify it in a way that I get a specific array. And what's to do here is I will name this object, of course, identities. And it is of type identity. That is great. But what I need now is that I have to tell the system I want to define an array. This is an array. And it should be a new array, of course. And that array here is then my specific array of objects. And the first entry, as you can see it here, is my Herwig Abele. And to let that at the end getting displayed, I need now some more of these entries. Therefore, I need then always such a wave bracket, and my next entry will be automatically be written into that. So first name, Holger, for example, and at least I need a start date, which is again a new date. And I don't need an end date, it was an optional parameter. And I should now have two data sets. The red lines show me there is something wrong. So Let's see what I did there. As you can easily see here, there was a mistake just by defining my interface. Easily to, at the end, correct. So then the only thing we have to do is, after saving the change, just to ensure that it get everywhere corrected. So, and with that, I can now copy that line more than once and enter some mock data, which is something we will not show because just changing text is nothing people need to learn. So, and after some typing, what you easily can see is, additionally to that one first record we just created, there are now a couple of other records available. They have different last names and first names, different account names, of course, cost centers, departments, start dates. And as you easily can see, I created here as well one record with a limited contract for Paula, which just shows as well an end date. Yeah? And that is something that is always a good idea if you work with mock data. Ensure that all different possibilities are included so that you easily can test that. This, if I store the whole thing, is then something you will easily see leads to a couple of errors. The reason why we get these errors now is I just changed the name and of course the type of my data object. And if I look into my HTML, you see the identity did not exist anymore. I can now, for example, just change it to identities, which is the new name I use. But as you can easily see on the red lines, it will as well not work. You get another error message. And the main reason here is I don't have a single record. Even if I try here just to use the complete object at all, the only thing I can get with that is, as you can easily see here, a lot of objects which just say it is more complex and as well not displayable. The next step will be just to ensure that we get the list displayed. Therefore, I like to show you how to format the whole thing a little bit nicer and to include into that formatting as well something that displays all of these objects. But before I can start with that, it is important to store these steps. Therefore, I step to my source control. You can see there are 3 files that all changed: the HTML, the TS, and the identities I created. I ensure with the upper plus here to get all of them into the staged zone. Here it is. Git works in a way that changes needs to step into the staged zone, and if they are in the staged zone, then I can handle them with the next commit. And this here is now my next commit. And with control and enter, the whole thing gets committed. Now you see I have 2 commits here. And now it is time to start with the next round. Now it's time for a little bit layout and of course to display all of these records we created in a list so that we can see them in the browser, for example as a table. To do so, I need a little bit more layout, and of course I can now write a lot of cascading style sheet information to get the layout done. I can use a lot of HTML tags, for example, to create lists or table structures and such. But to do so and to make the whole thing a little bit more easier than it looks like, it is a good idea to use a layout framework. Such a layout framework is used with the Identity Manager as well. Identity Manager is using something that is called Elemental UI. Elemental UI is something created by one identity, but it is at the end based on Angular material, which is a layout structure, a complex layout structure directly shipped together with Angular. For that very, I like to say, simple example, I want to keep it simple, and because of that, I will not use the Angular material here. I will just use another very common layout framework, and that layout framework is called Bootstrap. You can see that here on the right-hand side. This is the homepage of Bootstrap, and what allows me this is just to step to the installation section. Therefore, I have to follow to get started. I can of course install that remotely. This is not what I like to do. What I like to do is I like to include that online directly into my web project. And to do so, I have to include two things. On the one hand side, the cascading style sheet reference, of course, and on the other hand side, the script handler, which automatically then works with Bootstrap. To do so, I copy first here my CSS information. I step into my project here on the left-hand side, and the cascading style sheet information is nothing I will include into an app component. I will include that into the whole project, and to do so, I have to open the index.html, and the index.html came with the header, and part of the header, of course, is as well the styling information. So I just enter that very specific link into that header. And the second thing I have to do is I have to implement the handler, and so I copy the handler as well. And of course, the handler needs to be implemented into the body. So I just paste the handler into the body. You can see it there, and I store the whole thing. If I switch back to my Angular page, nothing happens, which is okay because I did nothing other else than just referencing the Bootstrap. And now I need to use it. So I can close my index again. I step here back into my app component HTML. And now we start layouting things. What we can do in Bootstrap is we can get, with the help of the Bootstrap documentation, a lot of information where I can find specific things. So there are examples all the time around, but there is as well a very nice Bootstrap documentation. And if you can't find it directly here, for example, in the Getting Started or here in Examples, it is easy just to step into the menu and to say Bootstrap Docs. And if I'm in the docs, I can now start for specific things. One very nice structure to lay out things is called the card. And so I just search for card information. And as you easily can see, here is a small bug in that specific browser. But by just searching for the card information, you see the card is something like that. Could look a little bit different as well. For example, like this. This is card information. And at the end, you can directly figure out what exactly you like to use. There are many examples. Some of them looks a little bit better than others. For example, I like this specific thing here. And so I just take the complete example, copy it. You can click here on copy, for example. And then I directly enter this into my project. And of course, I press save, step to my Angular project. And what you can see here is exactly the same structure than we saw it before. Pretty nice, because now our layout information exists and it's called Bootstrap. So the next thing is just to ensure that all gets displayed. Therefore, I will start with moving the one or the other thing around. First of all, as you can easily see, this is a card, there's a card header, and there is a title. So I just take that specific title and put it here into the header. So then there is a card body. In the card body, there is as well a specific title. This is my set of identities. And then there is a card text, and the card text is what you can see here. And there is a button. The button is something I don't need, so I delete them directly. And here in the paragraph, I will now enter text, but I'm not really interested, honestly, in a paragraph. What I better think should be here is, of course, a div tag. And so I create a div tag. And that div tag, for example, should be of class grid. Grid is always a type of data objects, and I can just use them as I like to define my data. In the grid itself, I like then to insert the complete set of data. And it is an array, and you can see on the right upper side, object, object, object. And that is for each of these objects of the array, I get an object because there are many properties in the object. And so what I have to do here is I have to ensure that everything gets displayed nicely and all objects gets displayed. And something like that, it's always done with the help of a loop in coding. That means I have to step through my complete object, and for each single object of my object array, I will then show some properties. To do that, I start just with another div tag. And this time I will write here something in with the help of a star. And I use one of the Angular features, and this is the ng4. And ng4 defines the loop I need to step through my objects. And in my ng4, I need then, of course, something that is called the let, and I need a single object I will use. I will call that identity. And this identity is of the main object. The main object, if I switch back to the components, is called identities. So that means the identity of identities. So, and with that, I can then directly start to display objects. And it is exactly the same what we did before. That means, for example, I will do that for one identity. So I will now use my data binder here and just say this is an identity, and therefore the first name, for example. And doing that and pressing Ctrl S, I will then see on the right hand side, if you see, a lot of first names. And the rest, of course, is then just typing. First of all, I started here with the grid. The grid itself does have the capabilities to be layouted in rows and columns. And so I will start here with one row. And therefore, I add here the class tag and put there a row into it. This is now my grid row, of course. And then I can start to define my columns. My first column should be here a column which just contains these properties. Later on, we will then add another column with more functionality. But for now, I like to say this should be good enough. So I take that specific property. This is my first name. I will copy that and enter directly the last name. And then we will just add a little bit more code into it. And of course, I told this is a column. And in that column, we will then display the specific values. It might be a good idea to define first and last name a little bit heavier sized as the others. And to do so, I will enter again a div exactly and only just for that specific first name and last name. And the format is then out of the Bootstrap. And for example, I use here the Bootstrap H5, which makes the whole thing a little bit better sized. If I use H5 here, it might be a good idea that my title gets here another type, for example, an H3 or such. That will then help to identify and to separate that a little bit better. So this is my H5. By the way, the class here in Bootstrap H5 is similar to the header H5 from a sizing perspective. Yeah, and the rest again is copy and paste. So I will just put that information in there. Can just press save. As you easily can see, I see now first name and last names here. And the next thing I like to implement is then, of course, for example, a little bit more text. So let's see, these are the names. Wonderful. And then the other properties, not too bad. From a layout perspective, we can directly improve that. So for example, here we have class H5, which makes the whole thing a little bit bigger for first name and last name. We can, for example, add a margin. M stands for margin, T for top, margin top, for example, of 2. If I do that, I get a little bit more space in between. And it could be as well cool In front of such a very specific entry, I can add a line, which is a horizontal ruler. And if I do so, then you can easily see I have now a line between my different entries. I think this is good enough from a layout perspective right now. Last thing missing is start and end date. So I will copy this again and enter here some names. So for example, contract begin and contract ends. So, and if you enter that, then you see easily that these date time values here on the right hand side, gets a little bit ugly, or they show me a lot of more information than I need, let me say it that way. And to handle that, it is possible to use something which is called a pipe format. And pipe format works in a way that I just add here directly behind a date time value, separated by pipe, a specific format. So for example, I add the pipe, then I say that is a date, and then I specify the format, for example, year, that is 4 digits for a year, then 2 digits for a month, and 2 digits for a day, which is an ISO date. And if I save that, you see automatically the whole thing moves to an ISO date, year, month, and day. Be careful with that. All of these characters are specifically defined. So the small caps here is the year. The capital M's here, these are months. Small M's will be minutes, so that is not really helpful. And the small d's here are, of course, then the days. However, that works pretty well here, and because of that, I can directly take it and enter it as well to my end date. That means in this case that I see end date somewhere. I think it was my second here. Then you see here the contract ends here, and all the other contract ends don't show anything because they are unlimited. And with that, I have created my specific list and displayed everything. And okay, let's clean up a little bit the rest here. That means in my HTML, I will just delete the objects there. I will take the card header, so I can as well delete this specific title. And if I just save all of that, then you see here my small identity manager, a little bit very small, which is then, for example, here an H1, for example. So, and then we have the small identity manager. We have here set of identities. We see our identities. They are nicely formatted. And if we step back into source control, we see that in total, we just changed these both files, nothing more. That means we commit the whole thing to Git, the whole thing works. So this is what I would like to show you in this case. And in the next case, we will implement a button which automatically will delete one of these entries.